Hello again. Okay, so we are back to my series on education reform. Today we're going to talk about what I would do to reform literature as taught in school. Once again, one of my solutions is going to be to slow things down a little. This is possible, instead of going through 5 books in a quarter or in a course, we go through 4 and we just do a better understanding of it. Um, so, I always liked to read until we took literature classes. And then they are forcing me to read things that I didn't choose and forcing me to look for all sorts of things that I'm not interested in, like themes and morals and symbolism. So all that is useful, interesting when you're interested in it. And as an adult, I've looked back at some of the things I've read in high school and said, oh, yeah, this is actually not as bad as I thought it was. But, as a student, I was more interested in plot. I wanted adventure. Didn't want someone telling me what the author thought and telling me I was wrong when I said, well, maybe the author thought something else. My thoughts were, books were to entertain. They weren't to teach deep feelings. Which, yes, they can teach deep feelings. It's not a bad thing, but as a student, I wanted entertainment more than anything else. So, now literature I do believe is important to read books, to study. Like I said, I enjoyed reading. I learned writing more from reading well written books than I did from all the grammar courses I took in elementary school. And yes, learning all the 21 rules for commas and stuff like that. It was important up to a point, but then they never gave us a good example of why this rule works or how this rule works. Whereas reading well written books, I was exposed to that. I learned more how to write by reading books than I did from taking writing courses. So yes, literature and reading is important. Now then, so how do we do this? First off, like I said, I like plot. And some literature should be read for plot purposes. In fact, you should read through the book once just to get the plot down. And we still have discussions on it. Only the discussions are on what happened. Now, reading analysis or reading comprehension, we learned that when we were a lot younger than high school. And it was supposed to be, do you understand what you're reading, basically? Look at the world today. We got, whether it's Fox or CNN or whatever news station, something happens in the world, they say what happens, 30 seconds telling us what happened, then 10 minutes of their analysts telling us their opinion on what happened. And then people who listen to opinions of those, they make memes on it. People share the memes on social media. It has nothing to do with the actual story. It's all someone's opinion of what happened. No details on what actually happened. So, yeah, that's because what happened. Literature, instead of reading a book for the plot and discussing the plot, we read the book and said, what did the author mean by this? And again, yes, they can have hidden meanings to their writing and stuff like that. And it's interesting to look for those. But at the same time, you should also look for just the plain plot. Now, a separate case. John Knowles. I didn't have a clue what was going on with that book. It's not a horrible book in retrospect. But it was a book written in 1959, I believe, was published in. It was covering 1942 and 1943. It was about two kids in a preparatory school in New Hampshire during, just before the United States entered World War II. And I'm reading this as a kid in a public school in 1980s. It was complete and total fantasy to me. This is not how the school system works, I thought as I read these books. Now, it is how preparatory schools worked 40 years prior to that, but we didn't get a good description of that. So, you read the book for plot, chapter 1 or chapter 2, first assignment, read chapters 1 and 2. Our discussion is going to be what's going on here. This is obviously not the school we're used to, and so we need background, basically. So, reading interpretation, you read it, what's going on, and then the teacher fills in the blanks. Yes, this is how schools differed 40 years ago. This is the difference between a preparatory school and a public school. And this is all stuff we should have been doing, but it didn't happen. So going throughout this whole book, it seemed like fantasy to me because I was looking at it from a 1980s public school point of view. The fact that it took place during World War II wasn't made obvious in the book until like the 6th chapter, which may be one of the early chapters. It did mention a year. Yeah, I'd have to go back and reread the book. But it didn't jump out. And the idea, we're going to be reading things that we are different from our experiences, didn't make sense. So like I said, it was complete fantasy. I did not enjoy it at all as a child because it made no sense to me. If we had done some background, one day's lecture, here's what, preparatory schools were like in early 1940s. This takes place during World War II, It was a different time. Yes, we're teaching a little bit of history during literature class, but it's necessary history in order to understand the books we're reading. They didn't do that. They expected us to pick that out from the reading without telling us to look for it in the reading. And while looking for other things, don't pay attention to what's actually happening in the book. Look for symbolism. Yeah, I hated it. Shakespeare. Now, Shakespeare, I like Shakespeare, and I think people should try to understand it. You're going to read at least one Shakespeare in high school. Most kids will, at least. I think through my 4 years in high school, we went through 3, Comedy of Errors, Julius Caesar, and King Lear. We might have done a 4th one, actually. I don't remember off the top of my head. So first thing off, Shakespeare uses a lot of different language, obviously. So you have to read it slower. Then you have stuff like Comedy of Errors took place in ancient Greece, which was never fully explained to us. And so we're trying to read it as Americans reading a 400-year-old Englishman's attempt to explain something that happened maybe 1,000 years prior to his time. We never discussed that at all. Julius Caesar, historical figure, we sort of know where he lived. Even then, it was never really pointed out to us in the sense of this is a really ancient thing and things are going to be a lot different than you expect. When Shakespeare wrote Julius Caesar, his life was somewhat of a part of a classical education. Ancient Rome, they discussed stuff like that. Caesar, because he invaded England, was a important figure, so they knew about him. 20th century American kids, not so much. In fact, history didn't cover Caesar that much. But we're going to read a play about him and expect you to understand it. And it's going to use all this weird language, which, let's face it, the common man in Shakespeare's time didn't talk like that. So, again, we have to discuss the setting of it, as well as we have to read it slower now because it's using all these weird phrases that the normal person in Shakespeare's time didn't necessarily use. And, I mean, there are others, A lot of them, for some reason, authors who tried to base things off of their life are covered a lot. Hemingway gets a lot of attention. I don't like Hemingway that much because it's obvious he's trying to justify his own existence, or he's writing to share his life experience, and he's trying to pump himself up a bit. At the same time, he's trying to make himself sound like a hero he maybe wasn't. I didn't like that. Yeah, I would rather have pure fiction over someone retelling their life story. So that's it again. Read them slower, read fewer books. So, we can go back, read it for plot. Talk about the plot. Analyze it based on plot. What is happening here? How does this reflect the times? Okay. Now the teacher's going to fill in any gaps we missed when we discussed how it reflected the time it was written in. Then go back and read it a second time, this time maybe a little faster, analyzing for what's a theme, what's a symbol. And get a better idea of what the author might have meant. Let's go to outside sources. Let's go to interviews with the author if they exist, or their biographies or whatever. Convince me that this was the theme of the book. That's one problem I always had. In my opinion, people wrote to entertain. Yes, some people would write to share their experiences or to, share their point of view, philosophy of life, or whatever. But in those cases, did they ever sit down and say, this is what I meant when I wrote the book? Or is this something that teachers in the future, scholars in the future, looked at the book and said, well, it's obvious this is a symbol for whatever, without a clue whether it really was or not? That was one question I always had during literature class was, how do we know that this is what the author meant? Did they leave notes behind? In some cases they did. Fine, let's bring up some of those notes and actually discuss. Yes, we have the lecture, discuss it. Did the students actually find the hidden meaning or not? And if they did, great. We pull out the article and say, look, in an interview, the guy said, yes, you got it right. If none of the kids get it, again, we can pull out the article and say, look, this is what the guy actually said. Of course, Shakespeare we can't do that with. Hemingway we can. Knowles we can. There are some more modern authors who did discuss their books outside, or they wrote letters to friends saying, well, this is what it's really about. And that information should be available readily, especially if literature is going to be a subject, then someone at some time should have gone through and read these, published books on these, compilations of what the author actually meant. And in some cases they have, in which case either the textbook should point the high school teacher towards those, or, there should be some reference that the high school teachers can look up in order to find this information. So that's it. My main big arguments against modern day literature courses are, one, students don't get to pick the books, so they're not as interesting to us. Two, we go through too fast. And three, we deal too much with the hidden meaning instead of going with actual stuff like plot, character development, stuff like that, which should be interesting. It would be more interesting to the students. and we can analyze without getting into philosophical arguments. That's it. Like I said, that's how I would correct the literature courses.